Hi guys, good morning. Start with some green check marks. As well, if you had any questions from the acids and base section that we kind of finished off last day, I would be happy to go through that. We don't have a ton of stuff to get through today. This kind of wraps up Unit 5. We're going to actually cover 2 sections today, but they're both very short in the class course. They're only a couple pages each, so really won't take long to wrap this up. And then we'll have another 1-hour class next day as well on Thursday. So, I see a few of you typing, so I'll give you guys a second to maybe enter a few questions in there. A few kind of clerical things. Unit 4, I know Abby had mentioned, the review for Unit 4 is there, but we didn't do a test for Unit 4. I never really thought much of it. I just kind of put it in there and I'm like, we might as well. So I'm just thinking because the Unit 4 material will be covered on the final and things like that, you should probably go and just go through the Unit 4 review just so you're aware. It's good practice, all the compounds and balancing and things like that. It's good stuff to know about. So you should do the Unit 4 review. Then we finished off Unit 6 a couple of classes ago, and a few of you had submitted learning guides for Unit 6, which was great. And I took a quick look through a version of the Unit 6 test, and there was an idea that came up that wasn't really covered very well in the notes, and I wanted to make sure we were kind of on the same page with it before you guys went and wrote that Unit 6 test. Now, if you'd written the test already, and there was a question on endothermic or exothermic reactions, and you got it wrong, you can let me know, and I can go back and have a look. But Unit 6 had 2 other things that I don't know why they didn't come up in the notes, but endothermic and exothermic. So before we're done today, I'm going to go through that because it does come up on the Unit 6. I had a feeling there's a few of you who probably wrote that and you're like, Mr. Borden didn't say anything about these, and I didn't, and it's completely my fault. But so if something did come up and you had issues, that's okay, we'll deal with it. But for the rest of you guys, fair warning, endothermic, exothermic, I'll go through that today. When is the Unit 6 test due? I was hoping you guys would have the Unit 6 stuff in today, so if you could finish the test today or tomorrow, any day before Friday would be great. It's because we're going to start Unit 7 tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but next class on Thursday. So getting Unit 6 out of the way before we start Unit 7 would be a good thing. And Unit 5 is going to end today. And it was a really short unit. There's not a ton of stuff in Unit 5. Just kind of odds and ends that don't really fit well anywhere else. So you probably finish off Unit 5 pretty easily. I don't think the learning guide's particularly long, and get that stuff in as well. So I didn't see any questions in chat about acids or bases. If something comes up, let me know, but I'll just assume we're okay with that stuff. So Unit 5 is acids, bases, salts, and organic compounds. That's kind of Unit 5. And we did acids and bases. So naming acids, how to form acids, acid-base neutralization type stuff. Now we're going to talk about salts and organic compounds, and that's it for Unit 5. Super short, really pretty straightforward. A little bit more memorization, but not terribly difficult. So we'll go through some definitions, and we'll talk a little bit about a couple of special types of reactions that you should be aware of. And then we'll finish. There's really not a lot here, so I don't foresee taking much more than about 45 or so minutes. So salts, we talked a little bit about salts already. Salts are ionic compounds that form when an acid and a base react, so in a neutralization. So you get the metal that's bonded with the base, and you get the non-metal that's bonded with the acid. They form together to form a salt. And salts, you have obviously table salt at your house. Salt is a broad category of ionic compounds, and students kind of get their mind set on the idea that salt is just that stuff that's in that shaker on your dinner table. But that stuff in the shaker is an example of one type of salt. There's many types of salt. So sodium chloride is kind of your typical salt that you eat in your house. Sometimes people have fancy salts that can be other things that aren't sodium chloride, but generally speaking, sodium chloride, NaCl, is kind of the salt that everyone eats. There was a disease that was very common. It's called goiter, and it's a thyroid issue. You have thyroid glands in your neck. And if you didn't get enough iodine in your diet, your thyroid would get really big and you'd have this kind of huge sort of lump on your neck, and it was called goiter. And people discovered that it was due to lack of iodine in your diet. So what nutritionists and things decided was, well, people eat salt, let's just put a little iodine in their salt, and that will allow people to not get this disease called goiter. So the idea was that iodine was added to salt. So if you see salt in a store, it says iodized. That just means there's some iodine in it. And now we have really good access to fruits and vegetables from all over the world, pretty much year round. And the nutrients that we get are a lot better than they were in the past. So goiter isn't as common anymore, not in North America at least. In other parts of the world, it's a bit more common. So you have a non-metal and a metal, or a metal and non-metal combined together, you get a salt. We put salts in lots of things. Batteries, explosives, fertilizers, multivitamins, all of your living cells have salts in them. You can have problems with your thyroid. I think, I'm not a doctor, but I'm thinking it's like a hormonal thing as well, can happen. I don't know a lot about it. One interesting thing that happened was, we're going to talk a little bit about this next class, or the following class, once we get into radiation a bit, but when the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan, the nuclear plant, melted down a few years ago and Japan had that big earthquake, it released a bunch of iodine into the air, and it was radioactive, and this big cloud of kind of iodine started to work its way across the Pacific towards the west coast of North America. And as a precaution, people started buying lots of iodine. And because if you consumed a bunch of iodine, the thyroid in your neck, your thyroid glands, they would be full of iodine already. When the radioactive iodine started to come and you started to inhale it, your body wouldn't need to absorb it because your thyroid was full of iodine already. So something just kind of I remembered about iodine and thyroid. So thyroid cancer is really common when you inhale a lot of radioactive material, because the iodine gets really concentrated in your thyroid glands, and iodine has a radioactive isotope. So something that can happen. Now, there's these kind of types of reactions that you need to know. So we've looked at types of reactions in Unit 6. We had synthesis, decomposition, single replacement, double replacement, neutralization, combustion. So those were the 6 types you needed to know. Now we looked at a little bit more specialized types of reactions. So a neutralization reaction we've already covered. So that's the first one here. You have an acid and a base. So something starts with an H, something ends with an OH. They combine together to give you a salt and water. So the example here, you end up with sodium chloride and H2O. So there is your neutralization reaction. The second type of reaction you need to know is called a metal oxide reaction. So a metal oxide is exactly what it sounds like. It is a metal combined with oxygen. So if I have sodium, Na, combined with oxygen, Na2O is what the compound looks like, and I react it with water, it produces a base. And if you do the exact same thing, except with a non-metal oxide, so you take a non-metal like sulfur, and you tack on an oxygen, and you react it with water, you produce an acid. So I'm sure there's some easy sort of mnemonic or something that you can figure out to come up with a way to remember these 2 types of reactions. I think metal oxide is pretty self-explanatory. It's a metal and oxygen, and a non-metal oxide, that's not going to be the tricky bit. But metal oxide produces a base with water, so MOB, MOB, and then non-metal oxide, NOA, MOB, NOA. So maybe somebody can come up with something better than that, and we can go with that. But these are two types of reactions you need to know. They can ask lots of different questions about them. They do come up from time to time. So metal oxide, water, gives you a base. Non-metal oxide, water, reacts to produce an acid. I don't know what an easy way to remember those is. But if you can come up with something you want to share with everyone, that'd be really great. So those are your oxides. Acids with metals. This comes up on nearly every provincial exam I think I've ever seen has a question regarding acids reacting with metals. So if you put a strong acid and you put a metal in it, you're going to end up with hydrogen gas. This is the important idea. So the question that I always see is it shows a picture. So it's not even saying these are your reactants, these are your products. What it does, it shows a picture of a flask and it says there's a liquid in the flask, and then it shows a little piece of metal in the bottom. And there's these bubbles coming up, and then the bubbles are getting trapped in this little tube. And it says, you know, what are the reactants here? What are the products? And it doesn't really tell you. It might say like hydrochloric acid and some sort of metal like magnesium, and you have to figure out what's being produced. So the important idea here is that you know that when you mix an acid and a metal together, hydrogen gas gets produced. And it kind of makes sense because acids, all acids have hydrogen. That's what defines an acid. It starts with an H. So if you put a metal in an acid, it's not necessarily obvious that you're going to get hydrogen produced, but if you're getting a gas, what's there? Well, in every single example, there's always H. So if you put a metal in an acid, you're going to get hydrogen gas. It's kind of important. Abby, to answer your question, yes, neutralization was the exact same as what we talked about in Unit 6. Remember, we did the units out of order, so we probably would have seen this stuff first, and they were just kind of showing what neutralization was. But you guys had already seen it in Unit 6, so there you go. So acid and a metal is kind of like a single replacement reaction where hydrogen kind of gets kicked out by itself and turns into a gas. So that's an easy way to remember that. The last one that kind of gets thrown in, doesn't come up a ton, but it is there, is carbonates and neutralizing acids. So I don't know why they throw in these kind of random types of reactions, but they do. So unfortunately, you need to know about them. But a carbonate is anything with a CO3 attached to it. So you're going to have a metal and a CO3. So carbonates neutralize acids. So if you took something like sulfuric acid, H2SO4, and you combined it with some sort of carbonate, you're going to end up with water and carbon dioxide, and then you end up with some sort of salt, or in this case, calcium carbonate. So super kind of tricky to remember all this stuff. For this particular acid and carbonates, don't memorize like, if I take this reactant and this product, I'm going to end up with this stuff. You just need to be able to recognize that you have an acid and a carbonate to start with. Those are kind of the key ones here. So your acid begins with the H, and then the other reactant's going to have that CO3 group attached to it. So don't focus on this particular example because they can throw in any acid and they can throw in any carbonate. The important thing is to remember that you lose your acid. So you're going to end up with water, carbon dioxide, and some other ionic compound. So this type of reaction is not common enough to include it with the like single replacement, neutralization, double replacement types of reactions. It's just something you should know that acids can be neutralized with carbonates. You end up with carbon dioxide and water, and then some other ionic compound. Like I said, this section's kind of a bunch of things just kind of tossed together. So there you go. That's kind of your salts. And then the organic compounds is its own section in the course, but it's not very long, so we're just going to kind of throw it in here. The most common thing that students think about when they think of organic compounds is like organic produce in a store or organic food, which are very, very different things. So the word organic kind of got taken over by this kind of movement where, oh, I'm gonna, produce my vegetables with no fertilizers or no whatever insecticides, and we're gonna call it organic. Well, that's great, but the organic that we're gonna talk about is completely different, really has nothing to do with that type of organic. So the word organic, when we talk about chemistry, means that something has a carbon molecule in it. And there's a few exemptions or exceptions, I should say, to the rules. But generally speaking, if we're dealing with something with carbon in it, it's likely organic. Now, carbon is awesome at bonding because it has these 4 valence electrons. It doesn't form an ion. It usually bonds covalently. And these 4 valence electrons are really good at bonding with lots of different things, lots of different combinations. So the idea here is that we can describe 2 types of molecules. Organic molecules have carbon in them. Inorganic, or not organic, both mean the same thing, don't have carbon. So long chains of carbon can form things like sugar. If you get an even longer chain of carbon, it can form something like carbohydrate. You can do long chains of carbons that form fats. You can go even longer and you can get things like petroleums, so things that you use in terms of like driving your car, gasoline, oils, those are all petroleums. And petroleums can be converted to make plastics as well. So all of these are examples of organic molecules, which you wouldn't really consider associated with food. So try to kind of draw that distinction in your mind between the food and the organic that we're going to talk about. Now, usually I ask a question like, do you think you could live without organic molecules in your life? And people kind of think about it. And usually there's 1 or 2 students that are like, yeah, I think I could live without organic molecules. And then we start to talk about it. Like, what are organic molecules? What are the things around us that are made up of organic molecules? So just looking around you right now, wherever you are, organic molecules are things like any living thing is made up of organic molecules. So have you ever heard the term carbon-based life forms? Usually like Star Trek-y type shows, they talk about carbon-based life forms. So humans are carbon-based. We're organic molecules. We're mainly made up of carbon. So what isn't water in our bodies is generally a lot of carbon chains. So we have all life on Earth is carbon-based. All life that we know of is carbon-based in the entire universe so far. So anything that's living around you is full of organic molecules. So you could get rid of everything that's living around you. So food, trees, plants, your pet cat, no more organics there. Organic molecules make up many things that are plastic. So think about all the things that are sort of plastic in your life. You might have a synthetic shirt on if you're wearing like Lululemon or something. That's made of organic synthetic molecules. Those are organic. My shirt's made of cotton, which comes from a plant, which was living. So that's all organic. So plastics, petroleums, all this stuff's organic. It's a huge category of molecules. And the important thing is that they all have this carbon sort of backbone, we call it, or carbon chain. So these are the rules for organic compounds and the exceptions. So you have things like CH4, has carbon in it. That's an organic molecule. C3H, C2H, OH. That's an alcohol that's called ethanol, organic. So all of these things in this chart on this left side here, these all have carbon in them. CH4, CH3, C, 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 C. And these are all organic molecules. There are a few exceptions. So these are your exceptions over on this side. These are inorganic or not organic. And unfortunately, these just need to be memorized. They don't really show up anywhere on your data booklet. You just need to know. Anything with a carbonate attached to it, CO3, is non-organic or inorganic. And CO, CO2, and CO3. So if you see a CO, a CO2, or a CO3, chances are it's inorganic. You also end up with carbides, and these are ionic compounds with carbon in them, and they're very few, but there are a few. So when the carbon comes second, acting as a non-metal, those are inorganic that contain carbon, so not organic. And then everything else that contains that doesn't contain carbon is considered inorganic as well. So the exceptions are CO, CO2, and CO3. Those all are inorganics, and then there's a few carbides, but they don't come up very often. The tricky bit here is if you look at benzoic acid, you see the CO in it, and you think, well, that has CO in it, it's inorganic, but unfortunately, that's not. So it gets a bit tricky. The rules are a bit blurry, but there you go. So remember, everything that has carbon in it, just assume it's organic unless it has CO, CO2, or CO3. Those are your exceptions. And then when carbon acts as a non-metal, very rarely does that happen, but it can, then you also end up with inorganics with carbon. All right, so let's look at a few hydrocarbons. I'm a big fan of taking words and breaking them down. So hydro, what do we think when we see the word hydro? Carbon. If we were to break that down into its two parts. Hydrocarbon. Hydrocarbon. We talk about hydrocarbons in our lives a lot. And then, if you took the word hydro and kind of broke up off this carbon part at the end, that's exactly it, Taylor. You're taking hydrogen and carbon. So hydrocarbons are things that only contain hydrogen and they only contain carbon. This is hydrocarbons. And we use hydrocarbons all the time. We use them in gasoline, you heat your house with them, you heat your water. One thing that's really common with hydrocarbons is they're highly flammable. Hydro, like BC Hydro, or what other hydro companies are there? We talk about hydro as, sometimes we talk about it in the context of water, so it can get a bit confusing, but they're usually a service provider that gives you gas to your house. So BC Hydro was the one before Fortis, I think. So hydrocarbons, carbon-based backbone. You can have the most basic hydrocarbon there is, CH4. You get one carbon, 4 hydrogens. These are all the different ways to draw the same thing. It's called methane, CH4. You can draw it with a structural formula. We've done these. These are kind of like the Lewis dot diagrams we did. You can write it shorthand, CH4, or you can draw a little model of it. And this is the main component in natural gas. Now, the thing about hydrocarbons is you have this carbon, and if it's not bonded to anything else, if it's not attached to another carbon, all of the little end things have to be filled with hydrogens. So you end up with this carbon. If it's not bonded to another carbon, well, everything has to be hydrogen or carbon. And every carbon has to have 4 bonds. So you end up adding another carbon, and you end up with C2H6. So if I add another carbon to this, they form a bond, and then I fill up the other 3 bonds with hydrogens. So this is called ethane. And this is the space filling model. We use ethane in plastics. The next one, we've jumped up to 3 carbons. So this is C3H8. This is called propane. You guys are familiar with propane. You probably have a barbecue at your house. Might use propane. Butane. Add another couple carbons in here, fill up the remaining with hydrogens. What's butane in? Well, you've probably heard of a butane lighter. Pentane is another one. You add another carbon, you get a longer chain, and you end up with that, and that's a component of gasoline. So, does anybody know what the main component of gasoline is? We base our gasoline ratings on this component. Sometimes students will know what it's called. It's one of the hydrocarbons. If you go to your gas station, there's different buttons on the gas pump. There's one that says 87, one that says 89, one that says 91, one that says 94. Does anybody know what those numbers represent? Nobody? That's unusual. You guys need more car people in your lives, I guess. Take a guess. So I go to the gas station and I press the little 87 button, and then I put it in my tank and I start to fill it. This is the quality of the gas, that's right. So when we talk about the quality of gas, we're talking about how much octane is in the gas. So an octane rating of 87, there's a complex sort of formula they use to calculate it, but it's the quality of the gas, and that's exactly right. So 87 means, it's not an exact percentage or anything, but the calculation they use, there's 87 octane. And then you can go up to 94 octane, which is just more octane. So if we think about the naming rules that are behind me here, we have methane, ethane, propane, butane, pentane. What do we know about the word oct? What does the prefix octa mean? If I had an octagon, or if I was doing my prefixes for covalent molecules, yeah, that's 8. So basically octane is a hydrocarbon chain with 8 carbons in it, and then everything else is filled with hydrogens. So in university, there's courses on organic chemistry, and they have these little kits, and there's all sorts of different types of these kits, but they give you these molecules. So if I take one of these little black guys out, this is kind of hard to see, but it's a carbon molecule, a pretend carbon, and it has 4 little branches that come off of it. So if I dig into my kit here and I have this one carbon, if I tack on little hydrogens on the outside, the white ones, I end up with this guy right here, and this is what methane looks like. So it's C, one black one in the middle, and then I have 1, 2, 3, and 4 hydrogens. So this is what methane looks like. So that's methane. If I grab another one here, if I add another carbon on the other side, so instead of having a hydrogen here, I've added another carbon. So I've gone from methane, now this is what ethane looks like. And then I can tack on another carbon, and then I have methyl, ethyl, and then the next one's propane. And then I add on another carbon, and I have butane. And I can just keep adding these on, and it just keeps getting longer and longer. Now I didn't put any hydrogens on this one, but you can see how many carbons I have. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If I add one more, which I'm going to do, here we go. Now I have 8. So pretend that there is hydrogens everywhere along here. So this is what octane would look like. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That is the main component of gasoline. So there's a whole branch of chemistry devoted to naming these things, and it's called organic chemistry because they're hydrocarbon chains. And it turns out that the naming conventions for organic molecules get really, really tricky. And organic chemistry is, I don't know the exact statistic on it, but it's one of the most failed courses in university. So if you go to university and you take chemistry first year, the first half is inorganic, the second half is organic. And the first half is really easy because you're all doing ionic compounds, you're all good at that. The second half is naming things like this. And it gets really, really, really tricky once they get really big. I'll give you an example. This is what octane looks like, but octane doesn't always form this way. So if I lose one, I guess I can't lose one. I'll add a little branch onto the end here. So I have 8 carbons. And now if I twist this guy a little bit, what I can do is I can join them back together, and I end up with a ring. And this is now called what? It has 8 carbons. So how do I differentiate this from regular octane? Well, because it forms a circle, I call this cyclooctane. So this is cyclooctane. I can have cyclohexane and heptane. And if I form a ring, it's now cyclo. So you don't need to know this for the provincial, but just give you an idea of kind of how complicated this stuff can get. Will there be a lot of organic chemistry, and will it be difficult? You should know the basic things like methane, ethane, propane. So 1 carbon chain, 2 carbon chains, 3 carbon chains. Beyond that, you don't really need to know a ton. So no, there won't be very much, and no, it won't be very difficult. It's extremely basic at the grade 10 level. Grade 11, it just kind of gets a little bit more difficult. This is something that a lot of people don't really kind of understand, yet they use it in their everyday lives. So everything around you has these hydrocarbon chains in it, whether you realize it or not. You're full of them. All the stuff you're wearing is made of these hydrocarbons. Every time you drive a car, you're running on hydrocarbons. And we understand that, okay, we take oil out of the ground, and then what do we do with that oil? How do we make it into things that we can use? So what you do is basically you heat it up. Sometimes they use steam and all sorts of other things, but imagine a huge oil tanker. If you in Alberta, you get that bitumen out of the ground. What do you do with it? Well, you heat it up in this, what we call a refinery. So this is an oil refinery, and it's just a big tower, and basically you heat it up, and the really heavy stuff sinks to the bottom, and that's what makes asphalt. It's that really thick tar, and it's basically kind of the leftovers. If you get it a little bit hotter, or I shouldn't say hotter, but you pull a little bit higher out of this big tower, you end up with bottom oil or heavy oil, or it's called bunker oil as well. And this is what big ships use. So they use very, very poorly refined oil, and it burns really dirty. And I forget the exact statistic. I wish I would have written it down, but if you imagine all the cars on Earth and you combine them all together and you turn them all on, there's something like 6 of the biggest tanker ships in the world produce as much pollution as all of the cars combined. So you think of all the millions and millions and millions of cars that exist, they produce a bunch of pollution. But because these big tankers are using this really, really low quality oil, the amount of stuff that they're producing into the atmosphere is really, really, really bad. And let's see if I can find it, the exact statistic, but I'm pretty sure it's the 6 biggest tanker ships in the world produce as much pollution as all the cars combined. It's pretty sad. Then you kind of pull off a little bit higher, and you get something like diesel. A little bit higher again, you get kerosene or jet fuel. A little bit higher again, you get gasoline for cars. So that's your octane. And then you pull a little bit higher and you get natural gas, so things that have methane and ethane in them. So that's how we take oil from the ground and we refine it. So behind me, this is an actual picture of a refinery. I don't know where this one is, but you can see all the different pipes. But you get this big tower, and at different points in the tower, there'll be pipes coming off it to pull out the different hydrocarbons depending on what you're refining. So that's how oil refinery works at a very, very basic level. Is natural gas the purest? Yeah, natural gas is made up of things like methane, which is CH4. Natural gas is the purest. When you burn natural gas, it produces the least amount of carbon dioxide because it is such a basic hydrocarbon. So natural gas is kind of like the highest. That's kind of like a methane, or a little bit more complex than a methane. And then propane in your barbecue, that's 3 carbon chains. So methyl, ethyl, propyl, so 4 carbon chains, propane. And then you get to 8 carbons, you get an octane, which is in gasoline, the main component. So the lower you get, the longer the carbon chains, and when you burn it, the more waste that gets produced, the more more carbon dioxide that gets produced. So yeah. The next one is alcohols. And you guys have heard of alcohols before. One in particular that humans put in beverages, but we use alcohols for lots of other things as well. So you guys have probably heard of like isopropyl alcohol. You might have some in your house. If you get like a cut or something, you'll use it to clean the cut. Kind of kills all the bacteria. Alcohols are really good solvents, which means they dissolve things really well. And if you think back, let's just take a quick jump back here. The most basic hydrocarbon was called methane. And then we went to ethane, propane, butane, and pentane. Those are the first 5 hydrocarbons. So meth, eth, prop, bute, pent. Remember those. Now we jump forward to alcohols. Methanol is the most basic type of alcohol. That's a one carbon with an oxygen on the end. That's called methanol. The next one was methane, but now we're going to call it ethanol. So that's two carbons with an OH tacked onto the end. And then isopropyl alcohol is one with the OH in the middle. Propanol is a different type of alcohol with the OH out the end. So just like you had methane, ethane, propane, butane, you can have the same thing with alcohols. Methanol, ethanol, propanol, butanol. So these are your alcohols. They're named in the exact same way. What makes an alcohol different from a hydrocarbon is that you have an oxygen in there. So as soon as you tag an oxygen in there, you go from a hydrocarbon to an alcohol. So I have this little alcohol right here. You can see it has two carbons, so one here, one in the middle, and then this red guy is an oxygen group. So this has two carbons and then an oxygen or an OH on the end. Kind of looks like a little dog if you put it this way. It doesn't actually form like that. This end gets twisted a little bit, but kind of a little dog. And this is, you can see it kind of a little bit behind me, two carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then your OH group. So this is ethanol. This is what ethanol looks like. And ethanol is the main component in alcoholic beverages. So when you're old enough to consume it, this is what you're actually consuming, is ethanol. What else we use ethanol for? Well, we can use ethanol for things like gasoline. In the United States, they have lots of gas which they use, it's called E85. And instead of having a really, really large amount of octane in it, they have really, really large amounts of ethanol in it. We also use ethanol in things like bread. If you are going to bake some bread, the bubbles that get produced in the bread are actually the yeast eating sugar to create ethanol. So sugar is really long hydrocarbons. Imagine like really, really super long hydrocarbons like this. What happens is the yeast will break down the hydrocarbon, and then you tag on a little oxygen and a hydrogen onto the end, and that produces ethanol gas, and that ethanol gas expands and creates those bubbles in your food. So the naming rules are the same. You have methane, ethane, propane, you have methanol, ethanol, propanol. The tricky thing with once you get past 3 carbons or 3 or larger, the OH group can be at the end or it can be in the middle. So propanol is the O off the end, and then isopropyl is with the OH in the middle. All stuff that I find fascinating that you guys don't really need to learn a lot about yet, but if you do move on in chemistry, you will spend more time looking at it. I think it's all pretty cool how we can just make all these molecules, and this is what they actually look like on a really small scale. If you could see these things with a microscope, unfortunately we can't, but you could see what they look like. So these little kits that you can get, they have little green ones, little blue ones. Sometimes these are like nitrogens. They have other ones, and they have something like 2, 4, 6 bonds on them, so you have different colors for different molecules. Sometimes you get orange ones for whatever molecule. I haven't done this for so long, I forget what they all really mean. So there you go. That's kind of it for this section. I told you really wouldn't take that long. What I want to do before we finish for the day is I want to talk a little bit for a second about exothermic and endothermic reactions, because I forgot to do that in Unit 6. But before we move back in time, does anybody have any questions about alcohols, hydrocarbons, salts, metal oxides, non-metal oxides, anything that we kind of went through today that you just kind of went over your head or you didn't understand? And I'd be happy to go through that with you guys if anything comes up. Or if you have any questions in general, I might be able to answer them, maybe not. while you're asking your questions, I'm going to play with my little molecule toys here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons, that's pentane. If I make a circle out of it, it becomes cyclopentane. And I can put other groups off it. If I add an oxygen group onto the end, it becomes something you've probably never heard of, but 5 carbons and an oxygen, now that's pentanol. That's how you go with these naming things. I think it's really cool. Okay, Abby, you need to go. No worries. The video up today so that I can see how those things work from Unit 6. We'll try to get it up as soon as we can. If you take this course in university, what could you do with it? I don't know, Taylor. You could work in a lab. So there's kind of like pharmaceutical labs, or people process things like blood, test blood for platelets, or maybe if you're undergoing cancer or something, they test it for like white blood cell count, things like that. So allowing you to work in a laboratory. And it is a branch of science, but organic chemistry is a huge branch. So they do some really cool things at University College, UBCO. They do some really cool things with agriculture. So looking at how ethanol, which is my little ethanol, how ethanol is produced in wine, to talk about winemaking. They have really, really cool sort of research going on there. So you need to know about ethanol, because ethanol is the alcohol content in wine. If you look at a can of beer, it says 5% alcohol by volume. That means 5% of that can is this guy, ethanol. Wine is usually like 10 to 15% in there somewhere. So that's 10 to 15% of that wine is this guy, ethanol. And if you were to take just general sciences, you would encounter organic chemistry. You could get a full degree in organic chemistry, just focus on organic chemistry, or you could get a full degree in inorganic chemistry, which kind of depends on what you want to do with your life. So instead of thinking, what can this one course do for you, you need to think in terms of a degree, or sort of the end, and kind of work your way backwards. I want to be a lab technician. What do I need to take to be that lab technician? Well, you have to get a chemistry degree, so you can focus on inorganic or organic, things like that. So yeah, kind of always working backwards. I'm going to jump into my notepad here, and maybe I'll go to some equations here from Unit 6. So I know I did these already. I just want to explain endothermic or exothermic really quickly. It's a simple idea. So exothermic, let's focus on that word exo. Have you guys ever heard of, pen's not working very well here, exothermic? Any words that you know that have exo as kind of a prefix? You've probably heard of a few that have exo that start. So think of words that have exo to begin with, and think of what that means. And then endothermic. So 2 parts to the word, exo and thermic. And then we have endo and thermic. Exoskeleton. Perfect, Taylor. That's the one I was looking for. What does an exoskeleton mean, Taylor and Anna? External. Perfect. Thank you, Taylor. So exoskeleton means you have a skeleton on the outside. If I had something like an explosion, what does that mean? Well, it means sort of expansion, outside expansion, outward. So exothermic, you guys know what thermic means, or thermal. That's a release or exterior, and then thermic is kind of temperature, energy. So if I said something is exothermic, that means energy is released. Exo, outside, thermic, temperature, energy. Really, temperature is just a measure of the energy of particles. So exothermic means energy is released. If I had something that is endothermic, that means energy is absorbed. Perfect. External, exo, endo. If you had something that's an endoscopic, so if you have like esophagus issues, sometimes they'll put an endoscopic scope down there to see what's going on. Endo just means inside, exo means outside. So if I had a reaction like the one here, let's look at letter V down here. And I talked a little bit about this when I was doing some of the demonstrations I did, but if I have something that is exothermic, that means energy is released. So it would be as simple as identifying what's going on here. So if I have energy on the product side, that means energy is being released. So if I have energy on the product side, this is going to be exothermic. If I had an equation where I had energy on the reactant side, well, that means it takes a bunch of energy to make this reaction proceed. So if you see energy plus, that means it takes a bunch of energy to make the reaction happen. So this would be an endothermic reaction. So if you have your energy on the reactant side, this is endothermic. If you have energy on your product side, that is exothermic. Another way we can describe these types of things is if we said, you remember when I did the elephant's toothpaste and all the bubbles came up and I'm like, oh, you guys can see the steam, it's really hot. Well, the reaction proceeded, it got hotter, so that means it was an exothermic reaction, energy was released. Something like a cold pack, if you have one of those in like a first aid kit, what happens? Well, it's just sitting there, it's just room temperature. You break it, and it gets really cold. Well, what's going on? Well, it's a chemical reaction taking place, and it's trying to absorb energy for the reaction to occur. And that absorption of energy is what you feel on your hand as cold because it's sucking the heat out of your hand. That's an endothermic reaction. Energy is being absorbed as a reactant. It's not getting hot. It's not producing heat. It feels cold. That's an endothermic type reaction. So those are the two things that kind of came up that I didn't spend a ton of time talking about. I did mention it, but there's a few questions in the multiple choice where exothermic, endothermic are choices. So just remember, energy on the reactant side, endothermic. Energy is on the product side, exothermic. Or you guys usually have a good concept, many of you did, of explosions or exoskeleton or anything like that. So that's energy is outside, being released, instead of energy going in. So if you can just remember that one part, the exo, energy out, then endo is just the opposite. That's all I want to say about that. So you guys should have your unit 4 should be done a long time ago, but a few of you still need to get that in. Unit 6 we finished, and I asked that you had the learning guide in today. So if you haven't finished Unit 6 learning guide, if you can get that in, it'd be great. I'll get that password out to you. You can write the test in the next few days. We're now also done Unit 5. Very short unit, not a lot of information there, but we're done it. So hopefully you can finish that off by, let's go with Monday, and that'll give you guys some time. Let's go with finishing this a little bit earlier than that. Maybe if you can get the Unit 5 stuff in by Friday, and then you can do the test over the weekend or on Monday. I'd like that Unit 5 test to be done on Monday, because on Thursday this week, we're going to start Unit 7, which kind of looks like chemistry, but it's actually technically physics. But it looks a lot like chemistry. And that'll probably be about 3 or 4 classes. And then we'll be done Unit 7. So we're just kind of We had a little bit of break, a little lull at the end of the term.